This episode, I'm joined by Renée Bergland to discuss her book, Natural Magic, Emily Dickinson, Charles Darwin, and the Dawn of Modern Science. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Renée Bergland, thanks for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Thanks for having me.
We are going to be discussing your recently released book, Natural Magic, Emily Dickinson, Charles Darwin, and the Dawn of Modern Science, which was published by Princeton University Press, who were kind enough to send me a review copy, so a big thank you to them. This is a dual biography of Emily Dickinson, poet, Charles Darwin, scientist, though we'll get to why he definitely is, but at a certain point in time, he kind of can't be a scientist, and also the dawn of modern science, as per the title, but also this I guess in a way an underlying story that's happening throughout the book is, from our position now, this sort of security we have when we speak of things like science. You know, we speak of this with such a security, but actually, as this biography shows, this development is filled with ups and downs and definitions and difficulties of definition, alongside being, a fantastic insight into the two figures. So, before we jump into the book, please tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and the genesis of Natural Magic.
Well, I'm a literature professor and a writer, and I've long been interested in the crossover between science and literature. And also at the same time, I'm really fascinated by that early period when science was, what we now call science, was more associated with women than with men. So I'm interested in science and literature, and I'm also just amazed that social assumptions and preconceptions about these categories of science and literature have changed so much over a relatively short time. So that's what I explore in a lot of my work.
Well, I'm going to springboard from something you said there, because I recently interviewed Kristen Girton on her book on materialism for female figures in relation to science and materiality, and part of that history of this binary that was sort of abided by at a certain point in time, where women were more thoroughly placed amongst materiality and matter and these kind of things. So with your interest in that, what do you think is missing when we sort of are ignorant of that side of history, or ignorant of that movement, to how we now understand things as very hard, very cold, very bordered?
Right. So part of what amazes me about this field of study is that these are bedrock assumptions of our culture, right? That science is cold and hard, and that science is also masculine. And then, of course, there's another one that men are cold and hard, right? So all of those are sort of bedrock assumptions of our culture. And it's just astonishing to me that in the recent historical record, 150 years ago, we find bedrock assumptions of a culture that are opposite from that, which I don't think we should take the lesson that therefore science is feminine or female. I think we should take the lesson that all of this stuff is in motion, and that it's lava. It's not bedrock, right? There's no bedrock anywhere, despite our shared assumptions. And that for me is just really, really fun. It's mind-bending and interesting, and I love to think about those other assumptions and then all the shifts that happen. I think it's really, really interesting.
There's something, I guess there's some sort of an ironic fascination with science that even though it's accepting of its own history, that it's constantly, we look back, some scientists would look back at old scientific breakthroughs and say, that's ridiculous, how do we ever think that? But now, of course, we finally found the truth, or whatever it might be. Every time we always make the same mistake. I wonder what it is that will finally allow people to accept flux, to accept that things move.
Yeah, I wonder too. I mean, I do think that it's possible. I think that the time period that I looked at is a time period when everything was in flux and everybody knew it, right? So it certainly is possible. And I think it's not only possible, but probably necessary. If we want to solve the sorts of problems, all the various aspects of environmental catastrophe that we're dealing with right now, we need a very human, connected, relational science. We need science, but it can't be an disconnected science that's unethical and uninterested in philosophical questions, because we're facing an existential crisis and we need to bring everything together.
Mm-hmm. So, moving into your book, there's a question I forgot to jot down because people will. I think it's a fantastic title, and I also should say, even though this isn't on video, but I will say it's a beautiful edition, a beautiful hardback edition by Princeton, filled with a sort of botany-focused cover. But the title is probably going to, I think, mostly in relation to Darwin, is going to seem strange. So, I think it's a good place to begin. Natural magic. Why? This is what the introduction is really about, is this notion of natural science, of a time when some notion of the natural was before many things, and then they became disconnected in some sense. But that included natural magic, and included magic as accepted, at least, definitely not as scorned as it is today. So natural magic.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the hardest things for a 21st century person to imagine. We can imagine magic, but when we do, we usually think about supernatural things. We think about ghosts, demons, angels, magic spells, wizards. Those are the sorts of things that come up when we're thinking about magic. In the 21st century mindset, the concept of natural magic is very strange, but it was alongside supernatural magic. People thought about things like gravity and electricity. And also, this is one that really interests me. One of the first books about natural magic was published in Italy, and it talked a lot about garlic. Trying to figure out garlic, like it's so different. Would cut it, smash it, it's juice, it's sticky, it's what's up with garlic, right? But all those things, whether it's magnets or bulbs of garlic, are material, natural things that are not really connected necessarily to angels or demons or the supernatural, but nonetheless have deep mystery and fascination. And how they work. How does garlic work? How does a magnet work? These are questions that, for many centuries, people thought of as the questions of natural magic. So if you take a person like Francis Bacon, for example, he talked about natural magic when he was talking about what we would call empirical science. It's investigating mysterious properties of things. When Bacon said science, he meant what we would now call the humanities. He meant knowledges of ancient wisdom and philosophy and broad categories of knowledge. He didn't mean empirical investigation. For him, that was just the word he used was magic. And of course, that comes with all kinds of connotations of mystery and unknowability that are lost when you change it from the way we use the word science now. The word science as we use it now fences off the unknowable and the mysterious. But that was not the case in recent history.
Mm. So in these investigations into these magical elements of the world, it seems there's been a change in the sense of control. Before we used to enter into it in a wonder where we might not work this out, we might not be able to figure it all out, but we'll enter into the mystery, as opposed to this, as we mentioned earlier, this cold, hard, shut off. we understand this, we know this. Is this the connection you drew between Dickinson and Darwin, that they both had had an innate love to enter into that mystery as opposed to the more empirical side?
So they did both love the mystery and they both loved the empiricism. But I would also say that I'm not a scientist. I'm a literature professor, but I come from a family of scientists, and I believe that the caricature of scientists as not interested in mystery, not filled with emotion and wonder, is actually just completely wrong, right? People who go into the sciences and who stay in the sciences and work, doing empirical investigations are filled with, they're fascinated. They wouldn't do it if they weren't fascinated. And so that's another thing that looking back at Darwin and Dickinson can remind us, is that the idea of the perfectly disinterested scientist, I think, has always been a fiction. It's not true now, and it wasn't true then. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, I guess the question is at what point did you maybe it's not sudden, but at what point can you remember when it was like, Dickinson and Darwin, there is something that
how did I put them together as a pair? Yeah. So I'd been working on trying to tell the story of Dickinson and science. That was how I started. And it's pretty common knowledge among people who study Emily Dickinson. It's not a surprise. There's nothing really to argue. She had a scientifically based education, and she went to Mount Holyoke, which was one of the first women's colleges, when it was called the Castle of Science. And what people did there was study the sciences. And so everybody knew that. And that was very often where it stopped. They were like, oh, yeah, Emily Dickinson knew science. How surprising, right? But what I was curious about was, what did she know? What was the science that she was learning? How did she think about it? And how can I tell this story so that it's more than just a curiosity, like, oh, how funny, a woman poet studied science, but more what was the scientific conversation that she was involved in, and how did she address it? So I thought about this for a long time, and it was when I noticed the parallels between her approaches and Darwin's approaches, and some of their really specific approaches. They both talk about wild experiments. They use some of the same language. And then I got so interested in the different ways that Darwin and Dickinson have played in history. So, for example, we know that Darwin was very shy and very reclusive. And we know that Dickinson was very shy and very reclusive. But that's played very differently about those two figures. Darwin is often presented as someone who stayed out of society because he was busy thinking great thoughts. And Dickinson is often presented as someone whose shyness and seclusion was evidence of some kind of neurotic craziness or something like that. So they're just very, very different. But in fact, they were living at the same time in similar sort of life ways, and they both had very similar days where they would be, connect a little bit with family and with people who were visiting the family, and then spend most of their time thinking about the natural world. And I was like, wow, that's an amazing parallel. They both did that with their days, and yet they've been remembered very differently. So I was hoping if I brought them together, I could give people some insight into Charles Darwin as someone who was actually quite a bit like Emily Dickinson, gives people the same sort of insight into Dickinson, that she was part of a culture where people like herself and Darwin could thrive, but then also look really hard at how they were investigating the natural world, and what it was that they were both trying to do. I should make clear for your listeners that they didn't meet, they never met, And also that they're not the same age. Darwin is 20 years older. So the prime of their careers is coincide pretty closely. Um, Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, and that's right when Dickinson's poetry really took off. She was writing 300 or 400 poems a year during the early 1860s. So the prime of their careers is at the same time, but they're not the same generation, and they didn't meet. And what I think, and what I tried to tell the story of in the book, is that Darwin's thought really was part of the fuel for Dickinson's poetic explosion, that much of her poetry was prompted by expounding and exploring Darwinian science. So that is a really strong connection between them as well, is that her poetry was so Darwinian. Darwin was not influenced by Dickinson. He probably never read a Dickinson poem. He probably didn't know that she was alive. He might have heard her name. He invited one of her most significant mentor, stayed at his house and visited him a couple of times. And so he might have known her name, but it's very unlikely.
Hmm. Did Darwin enjoy poetry?
He loved poetry when he was young. He took Paradise Lost with him on the Beagle and knew it backwards and forwards, which is also interesting because he's sort of famous as the anticreation guy, and yet he was fascinated by Milton's story of divine creation. He loved it. So that's an interesting thing. And then when he got back from his Beagle voyage, he immersed himself in romantic poetry. He was very proud that he'd read some of Wordsworth's longest poems a few times. That did change, though, however, after he became a fellow of the Royal Society and a more prominent man of science. He turned more to novels, and his literary pleasure was definitely, he said he liked novels with a pretty woman and a happy ending. So that was what he read later on. And then when he was older, in his autobiography, he said he really wished that he had never stopped reading poetry, that he had loved it as a young man, and he wished he'd never stopped reading it. But he had stopped reading it. He had definitely switched.
Do you think that feeling that he had, that he wished he'd never stopped reading poetry, maps to his own appreciation of science? That for a while, with poetry, it's a bit of a broad brushstroke, but with poetry, there's a bit more mystery, a bit more wonder. Do you think it maps that he wished he'd retained some wonder?
I think he did retain wonder in his life. And I also think that he retained a really strong appreciation for beautiful language. I doubt for me, since I love beautiful writing, I don't know if I would have been drawn to this project if Darwin were not a very beautiful writer. But he is a very beautiful writer who observes closely and then just describes with remarkable grace and detail. So I don't think he ever lost his sense of wonder, but I do think that as the culture was changing around him and as this sort of disenchantment narratives were starting to take hold, he worked very hard to publicly present himself as perfectly disinterested. That was something he really wanted to do. He wanted to present himself as that kind of cold, hard caricature that we were talking about in the beginning. I don't think that's how he ever approached it. He was much more, he would get earthworms and bring them into the drawing room and try to figure out their taste in music by playing different tunes on the piano. When he was an old man, this is the old Darwin. It's like playing music for the earthworms and trying to figure out what they like.
Did he ever figure out what kind of music earthworms are into?
he definitely found that they responded to music. I think that was as far as he went.
But they don't have a favorite, composer.
No, they didn't prefer Brahms over Bach, but no.
Okay.
But I just think it's hilarious to think of him and other things. He would blow tobacco smoke at them and see if they wanted to see if they liked smoking, and but all of that, it seems very playful to me, experimental and playful. And I do think that there was always quite a bit of wonder and fascination. I mean, that's why he called them his wild experiments, was because he didn't know where they would go, and he was driven by curiosity, I would say, which I think is very closely related to wonder.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
My opinion.
This curiosity brings me to another. I guess it's another thing that we do in the modern world. And I see your book as always having a sort of conversation with how we see things now and going, you know what, it wasn't, that's not quite right. And one of the things is now, with nature, we earlier you mentioned, Darwin and Dickinson's relationship to the natural world. And one thing we do in the modern world now is like, we speak of nature and it's like, I'm going to go out into nature. Like nature's over there, it's cut off and it's not, everywhere. I mean, there's stones and rocks and moss probably growing out my windowsill. Nature is completely imbued with the way we live. And it seems that Darwin and Dickinson, and this was like my favorite section of the book because I was astounded at how such a small curiosity and investigation could, excuse the pun, blossom into such a radical pursuit, which is botany, the study of plants, which includes, in the book, a image quite literally the great chain of being, this engraving from, this etching from like 17th century. And all of a sudden, all of this is tied together in the smallest sort of curiosity of what is a plant, what is an orchid in Darwin's case. And this just blossoms into, the natural world just being, something more for both these figures. But this radicality of botany is incredible, looking back.
It really is. Yeah, it's so interesting. It's not as surprising in the United States because in Massachusetts, where Dickinson was a child and where she lived, botany was very much associated with Native Americans and sort of witch women, right? So there's that kind of association, which seems anti-establishment, I would say, radical in some ways. But the English history is just fascinating. It's so Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, published quite a few books about botany, but the best one was called The Garden of Love. It was a very long poem. It's about 350 pages long. Where it's all about the sex lives of flowers. And it's in verse, it's rhyming poem, long rhyming poem, that's all about how botanists distinguish flowers based on how many pistils they have, or they did at the time. They would count the pistils, the pistil is, there's usually one pistil in the center of the flower, and then there are stamens around it that have the pollen surrounding the pistil. And Darwin thought this was an amazing, amazing sex thing because he saw the pistil as the woman inside the flower, and then all the stamens as the men. And sometimes there would be 5 stamens, and sometimes there would be 7, and he wrote this very long poem that went through flower by flower and explained the romantic love relationships between the pistil and the stamens in each of the flowers. So that was very radical and exciting, titillating for it was best-selling poem at the end of the 18th century. People just loved to think about the sex lives of flowers. But it's really funny because it now means that if you think of a young English girl at the end of the 18th century going out and picking flowers in a meadow, and then looking into the flower, as she looks into it, what she's thinking about is copulation, right? She's thinking about all these stamens and the pistil and what's happening there. Um, and so that sexual part of it, I think, was incredibly radical in a repressive late 18th century, early 19th century setting. And very soon, as you mentioned, it became anti-hierarchical because there's so much variation, and you can't. The great chain of being is this idea that there's sort of a ladder, and at the top is God, and on the next rung are angels, and then a little below angels are humans, and then it just sort of goes down. It has like mammals, and then reptiles, and then insects, and then plants, and it's all on rungs. It's a hierarchical thing. But as you explore what's happening inside of plants, you discover there are all kinds of relationships. They're interrelated with each other. They're active, they're passive, they're almost impossible to put on the ladder. And so I think it's because of that very close observation of plants in botany that people like Erasmus Darwin, Charles's grandfather, were able to make sort of biologically based arguments against hierarchy. If all this is happening inside a flower, then why would you say that horses are higher on the ladder than flowers? Flowers have a lot going on. So yeah, I think that's probably why it was so sort of intellectually thrilling at the time. One of my favorite stories about Charles Darwin, when he was about 5 and he didn't understand it, he knew that botany existed. And the story is that he picked a flower and took it into school, and then he and his friend just kept staring into the middle of the flower, hoping that the flower would tell them its name and tell them what it did. And they thought that that's what botanists did. They just kept like looking and hoping the flower would speak to them. And it never did. The flower stayed silent. But Charles Darwin and the boy who looked at the flower with him both became, had lifelong careers as biologists, and spent the rest of their lives trying to figure out, like, what is that flower trying to say?
Well, that's a good way to segue into a larger discussion on nature. What respectively, I guess, Darwin and Dickinson, what did nature say to them?
So
that's a huge question. Sorry.
Yeah, but to Darwin first, I think he was always interested in the things that crossed lines. He was fascinated, for example, with the question of, do the roots of plants think? When they're moving, when they like reach out for another plant, are they thinking? Is that a form of consciousness? Was a question that fascinated him his whole life. His first discovery was that he found out that something that was thought of as a plant, a seaweed, actually had eggs that were mobile and made it almost an animal. People still are unsure about those seaweeds. They call them moss animals, and they're like, is it a plant? Is it an animal? But he was fascinated by those things that are right on the line and that move back and forth, and that show interrelationships, lots and lots of unexpected connections. So that was what really interested in him was trying to trace all of the just infinite amount of complex relationships between and among living things. So, as I said, I think Dickinson was influenced by Darwin. And of course, she was a close observer of the natural world herself. But one of the poems of hers that I really like, it starts out, "There is a flower that bees prefer and butterflies desire." And it's about purple clover. and it's comparing purple clover to the grass. She calls them contending kinsmen. So she sees them as related, but she sees them as contending for sod and sun, she says, for the nutrients in the earth and the sunlight. And then she calls them sweet litigants for life. And I love that phrase, sweet litigants for life. I think that it's a response to what Darwin called the struggle for life. But when she calls them sweet litigants, she changes it a little bit. And she makes, yes, they're both advocating for themselves. They're both contending, but they're both also, both the grass and the clover, making an appeal for the living world. They're making an appeal for life. And that's where I think putting Dickinson and Darwin together is just so powerful, because Dickinson's a great poet. And as she describes these Darwinian relationships, she makes them, to me, more rich and fascinating even than Darwin does, although she's describing the same kinds of relationships. So over and over, it's connection, interrelationship, blurring of boundaries, and just a great love for all of the forms of life that both of them shared, with an awareness that there's often struggle and violence and death. There's a lot of death in both Darwin and Dickinson. But for them, that death is interesting and important because of the way that it shapes life. And they both see it as they see death as a force that is ultimately creative.
It's interesting in terms of that poem, the term that the butterfly desires, as opposed to simply a sort of mechanical want. Do you see Dickinson's poetry in the sense that it's having this, it's in this dialogue in a way with Darwin, that it allows us now, I think you do mention it in the book, that really much of the modern understanding of Darwin is still very Spencerian, still very, it's still ironically very Darwinian. When we say Darwinian, it doesn't have this openness and richness. And Dickinson's poem there with this notion of desire seems to put a bit of a, maybe not put a crack in the armor, but actually allows the armor of this sort of cold, hard survivalist Darwin to breathe a little bit and say it hasn't really, that was Spencer that took it this sort of determinist, survival of the fittest direction.
Right. So survival of the fittest is a phrase that Darwin used a couple of times late in his career. He took it from Spencer, who had described his ideas that way, but he did use it a couple of times, but he didn't originate it. It wasn't how he thought of it. The phrase that he used much more was struggle for life. And the struggle that he describes, he's very specific when he describes it in Origin and in later works, that, yes, occasionally people, like two dogs will fight over a bone. There's a violent struggle, but more often it's a competition to see who can co-adapt better and who can lure other species to cooperate with them more. So the way he sees the struggle is very much about co-adaptation, as he calls it. And often, and Darwin does frequently say this, but Spencer missed it, it's very often about being beautiful, right? Can you be more brightly colored as a flower? Can you smell better? Can you be more desirable to the other animals around you? If so, it'll give you a huge advantage in being able to, propagate and create more of your kind. But what's so interesting about that is if you're struggling to be attractive, right? That's very, very different from a violent struggle. It's still there. It's definitely competition. But it's a funny way to think of competition if the competition is to be more collaborative, right? So you're competing, the clover is competing against the grass to see which of them can work better with the bees and the butterflies. And the clover is winning that competition by being more beautiful, more brightly colored, smelling better, attracting more bees and butterflies. Yes, it's competitive in a sense, but it's not violent. And it's not how, before I started the research, it's not how I imagined Darwin.
Well, I exactly the same when I read your book. I mean, I always, when I think of Darwin, I think of sort of a Hobbesian all-out war between insects in my mind. There's nothing remotely passive in that competition. Right. Everything's, like has to mark out its territory or ultimately kill the other thing, not just stand there and look pretty.
Right, exactly. It's a really different vision, right? If it's kill or be killed on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's like, okay, who smells better? Who can release the most alluring fragrances? But Darwin is really clear that he's talking about the alluring fragrances at least as much as he's talking about the violence. And in fact, usually more, right? Because Darwin's basic idea of natural selection is that it happens very, very slowly over many, many generations. So two dogs fighting over a bone is one catastrophe. It's one violent blow up that happens once. That's not necessarily many generations, but lots of the things that happen in the biological world over many generations, Darwin argued, happen very, very gradually. It's tiny advantages that end up shaping different species. Not catastrophes, not big violent events, but tiny, just tiny changes.
Do you still see many of us in the modern world sort of using that language of the Spencerian, Darwinization of that hard competition, the way we understand things?
I think it's a very common view, yes. And I think that, so my perception is that if we use the language of hard and soft, which we've used a couple of times in this conversation, people often feel that they're being more rigorous and that they're thinking more clearly and maybe even thinking better in a superior way if they emphasize the hard lines and the clear distinctions. I think that's very common in my academic world and in many other, political worlds and business worlds as well, that the hard and the sort of violent in-your-face competition very often seems that that's a superior way of thinking, superior way of approaching the world. And I actually don't believe that it's to anyone's long-term advantage to draw hard lines. I really don't believe that. And I don't think that Darwinian biology argues for that at all. It argues for the other, for blurring and collaboration and co-adaptation and a much, much larger view, but also, I would say, a much softer view as a better strategy, a better way to think about how to survive. It's interesting because Darwin was never thinking about surviving as an individual. He was thinking about surviving as a species. And human beings are in a bad place right now. We've done a lot of damage in this era. There are a lot of environmental catastrophes of all sorts all around us, that I think give us some pretty strong evidence, that thinking non-collaboratively, and thinking individualistically and resorting to violence, and hard borderlines, it's not working out so well for our species. It's really not. So I think there's a lot we could learn if we could move toward valuing collaboration, not just toward being collaborative, but toward thinking of that as actually a very valid way of approaching problems. And that question of validity is one that we really struggle as a culture. We think that it's very often, we seem to think that it's weak, I would say, or inferior in some ways. And that is a mindset that we should change.
Mm. There's also there seems to be another irony here then, in that, as you mentioned earlier, Darwin as the anti-creation guy, as metaphorically the man who decenters humanity, who says, look, you it's not all about you. You're part of a long fluxing process, and you're just one part of that could easily just as easily die out as any other part, as we know have died out countless times. And yet one of the first things we then do is sort of take control of this, to begin to Darwinize and say, well, we know what evolution is, so look, we actually are still, we've even though we've been completely decentered by knowledge of this process, we believe that knowledge of the process sort of keeps us back in control. We can't fully accept that we are. I don't know if we've ever fully accepted that we're evolutionary creatures. It's not a nice thing to think about. It's nice to be.
Yeah.
It's nice to be the main character of the universe.
Right, exactly. The main character syndrome, definitely. I think that's absolutely right. And then that Darwin so often, or the sort of caricature of Darwin, the sort of caricatured idea of Darwin gets used, is very often used to advocate in one way or another for being masters of the universe, that humans have mastery over everything because now they can understand it. And so they do really, there is really, I'd say, a great misuse of Darwin when he's used as sort of an avatar of being a master of the universe. It's, as you just so eloquently described, it's really not what he was proposing at all. He was proposing that we're living beings on the great tree of life that have relationships and with all kinds of other species. A very, very different vision than the master of the universe vision, which is, I think, where it's very clear that Darwin was not a disenchanter, although he's often used for disenchantment. So the idea of disenchantment that Weber talks about is that there was a very specific time, post-Darwin, in the latter half of the 19th century, when human beings began to believe that they could master the universe by calculation. They could put numerical values on everything and completely understand it all, and there would be no mystery. It's odd that Darwin is an avatar of that mindset, because his work doesn't point that way. It just doesn't point that way. So that's very odd. But that's one of the reasons that I think it's quite productive to put him with someone like Dickinson, who was an early Darwinian, who was interested in Darwin, and who very persuasively expressed this great tree of life kind of vision, as opposed to masters of the universe vision. You said that you interviewed Jason Josephson Storm, and he talks a lot about this spiral, right? Where as soon as the Weberians declare disenchantment, many thinkers sort of say, "Oh, I don't know, I kind of like magic," right? And it doesn't. It was never a blanket thing. It didn't really disenchantment never really happened, right? It never completely happened, but it was one of those strange cultural myths that take over all the time. Where although many people find magic in all kinds of things, they imagine that they live in a disenchanted world and that sort of, well, our whole world agrees that disenchantment has happened. And I may find magic in a number of things, but I know the world agrees disenchantment has happened. And yeah, Justice and Storm does a great job of describing that cycle, that the more you declare we live in a disenchanted world, the more magical thinking springs up. In that world. It's fascinating.
Well, and I think the same thing applies to sort of that, in the same sense that culturally we all apparently unspokenly agree on the disenchantment, and we say, well, we live in a secular disenchanted world. It's very easy. Once again, we're in control. Everything's neat and tidy. Then, the same thing applies to that false category of Darwinism, where we say we live in a Darwinian world, and yet it's almost when you get down to the individual level or the communal level, there is still cooperation, there is still communities, there is still that there is, it isn't all that Spencerian Darwinism. So but there's an ease to just fall into those categories. It's like comforting. Yeah. So we all know what's going on, but then on the individual level you don't. Same with disenchantment.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's interesting, and many of us live in towns or communities that work pretty well together, with different people, lots of very different people with different views, kind of finding ways to collaborate and build things. That is local experience for many people, and yet it's sort of invisible in our larger cultural mindscape, where I don't know, I could almost call it like a hellscape. Like, we imagine that we just live in this world where everybody hates everybody. And that's not my day-to-day experience, even though I sort of half believe it. I don't know. It's complicated.
No, I completely understand what you mean. I think because it's the same as even though one has experienced that disenchantment isn't the case, Darwinism isn't the case, right, complete rampant individualism isn't the case, those big signifiers still manage to rule everyone sort of unconsciously, even though the experience is to the contrary. It's very strange.
It is very strange. Yeah.
What was I gonna? So what I wanted to bring in there, because I think that also ties with what you mentioned right at the beginning of our discussion, with this notion that scientists as part of those categories, right? They're like, I don't know, ordered and not wondrous, and they're all these just stood in lab coats having empirical discussions. Same applies to the mathematicians actually as well. And I think that whole side of things people get wrong. But when we go back and have this split between capital S science now and what used to be known as natural science, I wonder, do you feel it is we almost need like a reverse renaissance when we move back to science as it was understood with natural science, because that in itself it doesn't have the separation. It doesn't have that scientists as above, as controllers, or whatever it might be.
Yeah. So I'd say yes and no. I would say yes, I think that it's a great idea to move toward that older version. I would also say that for people who work in STEM fields and science, technology, engineering, math, they, as individuals, just the way we were talking about the small towns, they work very collaboratively much of the time. It's rare to have, maybe with math, sometimes you have the individual mathematician who's really separate, but most of the time, most STEM work is very collaborative. And actual practitioners I think are probably closer to the natural sciences as you described them than to our sort of mythological, very, very hard individualistic STEM, which I think is in practice not how it's happening. It's really not how it's happening. I do think that there are some changes that I would advocate for. I think that in education, we need to do a lot better job of integrating philosophy and ethics with scientific training, because I think a lot of people who practice STEM fields um, feel, I'd say, a little bit too humble, a little too epistemically humble about social questions and ethical questions and so on and so forth. They feel like, oh, I can't, and that's something they should, as educational systems, we should work to give them a little bit more confidence because the decisions you make as an engineer, say, have large social consequences. And to send engineers out into the world without the confidence to make judgments about social impact is it's bad for them. It's also really bad for our society. You know, they make decisions that they wouldn't make if they were confident in their own social judgment. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm trying to say? So I do think there need to be some changes in education, a little bit less separation, a little more integration. Similarly, I'm as frustrated by the humanities students I teach who say, oh, I can't do math, I can't do science, as I am by the science students I teach who say, oh, I don't understand the arts and I can't do social. Like on both sides, I think that regardless of, I think it's true that many people have a strength, right? They're really strong in one thing, and that's true. Very many people have a talent that's their talent, but that doesn't mean that they should shut themselves off from other ways of thinking and approaching things. And I think integrating disciplines as an education system would do a lot for all of us. I do think that's a change that I would advocate for, much more integration and less separation.
Well, Darwin and Dickinson both seem to be representative figures of being, key examples of what that looks like.
Right. Well,
Practice.
it's funny historically because they both had exactly the wrong education, right? So Darwin went to a school that really only taught history and classical languages. Shrewsbury then there was a little bit of math, but no biology, no chemistry, no natural philosophy at all. So that was really the wrong education for Darwin. And similarly, Dickinson went to a school that had the classic girls' school curriculum at the time, which emphasized chemistry, botany, geology, astronomy. And they both read Milton. So they both read Milton in school, Paradise Lost. But Darwin was taught much more about composition, like composite Latin verse. He was taught to that kind of stuff, and he hated it. And Dickinson was not taught nearly as much about writing and letters and poetics. And I don't know what that shows. Like, so they both studied the opposite thing, and then they both became really great at, you see what I mean? It's like, it's
Very productive teenage rebellion.
right, exactly. Yeah. But I do think that Dickinson's poetry would not be as interesting, or I don't think as great, if she hadn't had that deep scientific education. And Darwin probably would have observed many of the same things if he hadn't had that, really, really strong classical education that he had. But I don't know if he would have written the beautifully argued, carefully reasoned, incredibly well constructed prose that was what actually changed the world. If he hadn't had a really strong education that focused on letters. So it is interesting to think about, but both of them, I would say, make the case for crossover. Although in their own cases, I think Darwin especially, he was so frustrated. He just hated school so much. He really did not want to study Latin poetry.
What would you like people to take from the book and to take out into the world in their understanding of, I guess, of the sciences in particular?
I'd like them to think of magical thinking as valid. I'd like people to not think that we have to draw clear lines and boundaries between everything, that's the only valid way to think, but instead to think that there's real validity in allowing ourselves to think alongside of the connections that we don't understand, that cross boundaries in ways that we don't necessarily understand. We don't have to master the universe, but we do have the chance to think along with it.
What does thinking along with the universe look like?
Oh, it looks like being open to the mysterious connections and relationships and the manifold changes in perspective that looking at relationships bring you, so that yes, clover has one type of relationship to grass and another to bees and another to butterflies and another to humans. And the more you add to it, the more these relationships become infinitely complex. And really not masterable, right? We're never going to master the clover. But we can listen to the clover. And when the clover and the grass make their appeal for life and the living world, we could pay attention.
Is there anything you'd like to add about your book that you feel is key that we've not touched upon?
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job of talking about it. I think I hope that readers will come to it for the story of these two really wonderful and interesting people who had separate but intertwined lives. And as they follow along their stories, I hope that they'll also be drawn into entertaining their ideas and thinking about all of the things that they thought about. So I love the combination of great complicated ideas and human stories. And I hope people will take a look at the book and see how they come together for Darwin and Dickinson.
Well, I'll be sure to put the links for Natural Magic in the description below, and it is a beautiful book as well. And once again, thank you to Princeton University Press. And I believe now you're working on a book on 4 American male, so Melville.
It's changed a little bit.
The question is, are you working on anything now? But
so I'm working on 2 things. One is a book called Poetry for a Burning Planet, which probably informs our conversation today because I've been thinking about that so much, how poetry can speak to the environmental crisis. And then the other is a book about American writers, which has changed since that description that you saw. It's called Hidden Hands, The Secret History of Moby Dick. And it's about how Herman Melville's novel Moby Dick had a lot of different people, a lot of different writers behind it. And it's more a biography of the book than a biography of Melville, but it's the story of all of the collaboration that went into that great, very individualistic story.
Both of those projects sound fascinating, and hopefully in time I'll get to discuss Moby Dick with you.
Oh yeah, I would love to. It's been such fun to talk to you today, James. Thank you very much.
Renée Bergland, thanks very much.